Saipan, June 24th, 1944, dusk. The coral breathes out heat and the air tastes of cordite and lime dust. From a cave mouth, 19-year-old Aiko Nishida, a student nurse conscripted into a field aid post, steadies a feverish child. Below her, PFC Gabriel Gabe Delgado, 2nd Marine Division rifleman and ad hoc interpreter, slides a dented canteen forward with both hands open, his M1 Garand slung muzzle down in deliberate non-threat. The child drinks. No shot follows. The silence is louder than gunfire. Delgado speaks in halting Japanese from a sweat-smudged phrase card. "We will give food. We will give medicine. Come out slowly." He keeps his helmet low so he does not loom. A corpsman kneels beside him, gloved hands steady over an enamel basin. The smell of iodine cuts through mildew, wet limestone, the copper note of old blood. In the cave's gloom, mothers look at one another, calculating. The first white cloth, a scrap tied to bamboo, moves like a timid flag. 5 figures emerge, blinking as if the light. Aiko notes trifles that contradict everything she has been taught. The way the corpsman murmurs to the child as if to a nephew, the precision with which he breaks a chocolate bar into neat squares, the absurd abundance of canteens and bandages. She was told Americans would ravish the weak. Instead, they follow a checklist. Water first, bleeding next. Names, ages, injuries, tallied in a pocket notebook as if order could be conjured by graphite and will. Behind the ridge, the Seabees bulldozers growl. A Sleto airfield, taken, renamed Isley, will be laying Marston matting by week's end. The sky carries a haze of burned powder and salt. Out on the horizon, a grey procession of ships holds station like a floating city. A DUKW coughs through the lace of surf, waddling from ship to shore without waiting for piers or permission. It feels obscene, this ability to make infrastructure appear on command. Delgado repeats the ritual. Palms open, muzzle down, voice soft. A teenage boy bolts. A Marine with a corporal's chevrons sprints, overtakes him, and turns him by the shoulders without raising a rifle. Trust is performed like drill. When a grandmother stumbles, the corporal lifts her as if she were his own. Aiko watches the choreography, the practiced patience, the economy of motion, and understands that kindness here is disciplined rather than sentimental. She will not call these men heroes. That would make them distant again. In her notebook's margin, she writes a word she was taught for heaven's messengers, not to name them, but to name the shock inside herself, a private translation of survival. Tenshi, angels. She folds the gum wrapper and keeps it as proof that the world is larger than the cave and more complicated than the leaflets. Morning turns the limestone pink. The squad forms a half-moon below the cliff, rifles slung, helmets nicked, pockets bulging with field dressings and hardtack. The formation looks ceremonial because it is. Contact, reassure, process. Delgado calls again, the Japanese syllables rounded by California Spanish. A second cave yields 3 families. A third, 4 young women with canvas satchels stitched like student kits. No one rushes. The Marines have learned that quiet is faster than speed. At the foot of the path sits a DUKW, a 2.5-ton amphibian capable of hauling 5,000 pounds or 2 dozen souls wherever the water will bear it. Its engine burbles like a patient animal. A coxswain in a faded life vest scratches a tally on a clipboard while a private stacks crates marked Ration, K, Unit. The cellophane crackle of chocolate and chewing gum lifts like a minor anthem. Even veterans would later remember those sounds. Noise becomes memory when it arrives exactly when hunger does. Camp procedures begin in miniature. A military government officer lays a map across his knee, collection points inked in red, water points in blue, latrines flagged downwind. He does not ask, "Who are you?" so much as "How many?" because the doctrine assumes that people, like shells and gasoline, must be counted to be saved. Water first. Rice ladled from a GI can. A rope line to keep the queue honest without humiliation, a camp rule that feels like dignity rather than command. The officer teaches with gestures, Aiko translates, then falls in to bandage hands. News filters up the ridge. Aslito, now Isley, will take the first transports within days, a runway assembled from interlocking slabs of steel called Marston Mat. Air power arrives not as thunder, but as pallets and bolts. For Aiko, the revelation is not the number of planes, but the speed at which the Americans assemble the future and walk into it as if it had always been there. When a teenage boy panics and breaks, a corporal outpaces him without unslinging his rifle, circles and guides him back with a palm on the shoulder. Trust is rehearsed like a bayonet course. The boy sobs, the corporal pretends not to notice. Somewhere out on the anchorage, a floating city exhales. Transports, oilers, repair ships, its rhythm so steady that the island cannot help but sink to it. At dusk, the officer erases a chalkboard and writes a fresh line. Food issued, 312 meals. Water, 198 canteens. Civilians transferred, 36. The numbers feel banal until you imagine being thirsty. The chalk dust floats like incense as the squad beds down between coral and canvas, ready to repeat the rite at dawn, one measured kindness after another. Marpy Point, early July 1944. The cliff is a broken tooth biting the pewter sea. Rumours sprint ahead of fact. Americans bayonet babies. Families leap to cheat monsters. Delgado's squad takes post 50 yards back, orders clear, speak, don't snatch. A military government captain unrolls a map that flaps in the wind like a captured flag. Beside him, a loudhailer crackles alive, its voice a strange mercy translated into air. A line of young women appears at the lip, bandaged knees, student satchels, eyes rimmed red from cave smoke. Aiko is among them. She recognizes the interpreter's voice from Purple Heart Ridge and calls to an older woman who clutches a grenade like a prayer bead. Come down. Water. Medicine. The woman opens her fist. A corpseman takes the grenade with the casual gravity of a man pocketing a cigarette, then trades her a tin cup. Ritual defeats rumour. The day has a rhythm now. Trucks nose forward in timed gaps. A jeep scouts the hairpin. The DUKW makes shuttle runs between beach and bluff. A tent rises with a Red Cross brassard on the ridge, its guy lines tight as violin strings, the lantern hooks already waiting for evening. Rice bubbles in a battered field pot. To Aiko, the tent seems to have been waiting just off stage. The Americans have not improvised this world. They brought it with them pre-measured, pre-labelled, ready for assembly. Word reaches the ridge of the Great Banzai Charge 2 nights earlier, thousands of men breaking through rear echelons in a last doomed wave. The shock was real and terrible. Yet by morning the Americans had reclosed, resupplied, re-established aid stations and mess lines as if slamming a drawer. Abundance, it seems, can be resilience made visible. The captain reads a logistics note that would have sounded like myth a year earlier. In 1944 alone, the United States built roughly 96,000 aircraft, more in 12 months than Japan could hope to assemble in years. Across the war, American factories will turn out around 354,000 planes to Japan's 76,000. Numbers like carrier decks. Numbers like weather, arriving whether men believe or not. Aiko cannot picture them. Delgado tries and fails. The captain simply underlines the figures and pockets the note, an amulet against doubt. As the sun lowers, a gust tilts the loudhailer's tripod. Delgado steadies it with one hand, the other open toward the cliff. The air smells of salt and cordite. A grandmother takes the last 3 steps down and places her palm against his chest, as if confirming that hearts beat the same on both sides of the sea. Behind them, the tent's lanterns bloom one by one, a village summoned from canvas and will. Okinawa, May 21, 1945. The first real rains arrive like a punishment and a pardon. The ward tent sags, canvas dark with water, ropes creaking. Lieutenant Ruth Ellery tightens a guy line with one hand and steadies a litter with the other, while a corpsman counts breaths on a wristwatch. Mud sucks at their boots. Iodine stings the air. Outside, a queue of 6x6 trucks idles, their exhaust turning to ghost in the downpour, headlights diffused into pale halos. Inside, triage is a choreography that would have been drilled stateside and repeated until it became lullaby. Cut, clamp, swab, tag. Plasma hangs from a makeshift stand. Penicillin arrives by crate and leaves by syringe, scheduled like artillery. Ellery has learned to read the storm by the flicker on her Coleman lantern and to ignore it when a child's ribs show like crossed fingers. Aiko, now assisting as a translator, moves between beds, carrying words as if they were bandages. The 10th U.S. Army runs like a gearbox in rain. 3 amphibious corps on the left, 24th Corps on the right. Divisions rotating, reserves slotting, replacements flowing. Civil affairs teams expand camps inland from Yontan and Kadena, where mess lines and latrines appear in grids, each stake tapped to a book. The predictable miracle is predictability itself. Rations at dawn, vaccinations at noon, evacuation trucks at last light. Delgado steps in from the weather with a clipboard laminated in grease pencil. He asks for phrases Aiko would recommend to calm mothers whose infants will be evacuated by C-47. She suggests the words for just a little while and you can come tomorrow. He practices the syllables until his tongue cooperates. When a truck horn barks, Ellery looks up and nods. Somewhere a runway has been measured out of coral and stubbornness. Technical details seep into the prose of the day whether anyone wants them or not. The M1 Garand leans against a tent pole, 8 rounds eager in its en-bloc clip. Across the mud, a Sherman idles with the heavy patience of a 5-man crew. But it is the small devices that win afternoons. The sterilizers hiss, the thermometers glint, the exact angle of a litter on a slatted floor so water will run away from wounded feet. At dusk, Ellery chalks a board with numbers that comfort and condemn in equal measure. Admitted, 46. Evacuated, 31. Died, 3. She leaves a space for tomorrow as if the future were another ward bed waiting its patient. Outside, rain needles the canvas with the persistence of a doctrine, and the camp lights glow like a string of careful promises, each bulb a small refusal to yield the night. South of the Shuri line, the staff cave breathes damp and kerosene. Major Kenji Tsuboi studies a sand table lit by a carbide lamp. The ridges are ribs. The pinned unit markers look like scabs that will not heal. Runners bring casualty slips and ammunition ledgers. The paper feels already old as it leaves their hands. Doctrine says no banzai, layered defences, reverse slopes, fire from caves. But doctrine cannot summon shells. He briefs his officers in a voice that would once have been steel. Hold to the next ridge. Trade space for blood. Make the Americans pay. They nod, because there is dignity in the form even when the content thins. Then the quartermaster sets down the arithmetic. 2 belts for the Nambu machine gun, 15 rounds per rifleman, grenades in handfuls, mortar rounds precious as diamond rings. Courage is irrelevant when the magazine is nearly empty. An Arisaka Type 99 with a chrome-lined bore is still only a stick when there are 15 cartridges to live on. A clerk slips him an appendix from the Intelligence Digest. He reads it twice, once as a soldier, once as a citizen. In 1944, the United States built nearly 96,000 aircraft. Japan managed perhaps 28,000. Across the war, American output totals on the order of 354,000 machines of the air to Japan's roughly 76,000. The numbers are not news exactly, but they are a weather report no one can outmarch. He knows. The Americans' names now: 10th Army, 3rd Amphibious Corps, 24th Corps. He has memorized the sound of their guns like a bad hymn. Their artillery arrives by schedule, not by courage. Naval guns speak in tons per hour, not shells per day. Their road builders cut ravines into avenues in a day. Their medical tents multiply like mushrooms after rain. He looks at his own map and sees only arrows pointing towards smaller spaces. Rumours intrude wearing civilian faces. Families slipping to the Americans. Children returning with blankets and stories of rice ladled from big pots, of bandages opened without counting, of soldiers who lower their rifles the way men remove shoes indoors. He can call it cowardice or treason, or he can admit that fear dissolves when a hot meal repeats itself on time. That night he smears the soot mark on the cave wall that showed yesterday's front line and draws a new one closer in. The gesture is an act of fidelity to truth. When he blows out the lamp, he leaves his finger black as a pen. He does not pray. He listens to the earth drip and wonders how long a nation can swing a sword after its hand has gone numb. They read the report by lantern because the story refused the dark. USS Comfort, AH-6, a hospital ship with red crosses lit like chapel windows, struck by a kamikaze. 28 dead, nurses among them, operating room mangled, decks scorched. The facts arrive unadorned, a surgeon's handwriting over grief. Lieutenant Ellery feels the familiar sternness move into her hands. There will be no speeches in the ward tonight, only work. What followed would have seemed impossible to anyone who has not watched a continent move. The evacuation chain flexed but did not part. Other hospital ships took patients as if they had been practicing for the moment. Shore facilities surged. Litter teams moved like a single animal. Supplies arrived as if the universe had noticed a subtraction and added back the missing numbers. Sutures, plasma, blankets. The ledger noted loss and then wrote continuance on the next line, as if this too had been planned in the blueprints at shipyards and depots far from the front. Offshore and along the Hagushi beaches, the kamikaze campaign burned like a fever. 36 Allied ships would be sunk in the operation, hundreds damaged, and yet sea control and logistics schedules held. Convoys still hove into view at dawn, pale grey columns bringing food, ammunition and medicine on timetables that ignored the enemy's courage. The impossible statistic is not a ratio, but a refusal. A system that can absorb disaster and maintain promise-keeping. In the ward, Ellery's lantern throws steady circles of light across enamel basins and the chrome shoulders of instruments. Aiko translates as mothers cling to stretchers and ask if their children will fly away and come back tomorrow. Delgado practices the correct words until his tongue cooperates. The Coleman hisses, the sterilizer ticks. Outside, a DUKW grumbles up from a flooded ditch and a sergeant shouts a time hack. It sounds like a factory working second shift, output measured in heartbeats, saved rather than widgets, stamped. Technicalities take on the gravity of prayer. Penicillin by the unit, plasma by the bottle, litters angled so water runs away from wounded feet. The M1 Garand leans against a pole as if even rifles require rest. On a clipboard, Ellery logs evacuated. 31. Admitted, 46. Deceased, 3. Numbers as apologies, numbers as vows. Toward midnight, the rain softens to a mist that makes the camp lights bloom. Ellery sets the report beneath a cup to keep it from skittering away and allows herself a thought with no romance in it at all. We could absorb 10 nights like this and still keep our word in the morning. She is not boasting. She is observing the size of the hands that hold them all. The loudhailer coughed like an old engine and put a gentle voice into the limestone. Food, water, medicine. Delgado's cadence had become even, unhurried, as if he were calling a cadence march no one. Had to obey. The answer was not a shot, but a rustle, the sound of an orchard shaken free of birds. Women stepped out first with hands high, then children carried like parcels, then the old men with the stubborn dignity of people who have already said farewell and somehow stayed. Procedure would have looked like compassion even if it were not. A rope line, a pot of rice, a queue that held shape without guards. Aiko translated rules that turned rumour into routine. Show your bandages, leave weapons, you will eat again at dusk. When panic flashed through the crowd and a teenage boy bolted, a corporal outpaced him, circled and guided him back with a hand on the shoulder, muzzle still down. Trust rehearsed like drill remains trust. Then the storm came in a single breath, a wall of brown water ripping through the ravine. A DUKW bucked its bow against the surge, bilge pump labouring, coxswain white-knuckled behind the wheel. Marines formed a human chain in water up to their web belts, while Ellery's tent took the soaked and the shivering steam and iodine, turning the air clean and sharp. Aiko's voice held both languages together, as if the rope line ran through her throat. By evening the camp smelled of wet canvas, boiled rice, and the faint machine oil of rifles laid aside. Mess discipline produced dignity. Children ate first, elders next, soldiers last. The tally at the gate turned lives into arithmetic that could be honoured. Civilians processed today meant fewer stragglers on the line tomorrow, fewer tragedies for patrols to stumble across, more infantry free to do the ugly work that still remained on the ridges. Technicalities, again, were the grammar of mercy. Chlorinated water points, latrines sited downwind at regulation distance, a table of dosages pinned with a safety pin to a post. The M1's 8-round clip waited in steel patience while bandages took precedence. Overhead, the weather let up just enough to show a wedge of sky, and in it a C-47 crossed like a sentence finishing itself. After lights out, a Marine left 4 squares of chocolate on a child's blanket and walked back to the line without waiting for thanks. Aiko stooped for the wrapper as if it were a relic. She tucked it into her notebook next to a new word she would not say aloud, a private translation, not for men in uniform. For the moment she stepped into rain and did not die. The runway grew like a rumour that proved itself by evening. Seabees laid mast and mat over coral while rain needled their necks. Each corrugated panel clanked and bolted into the next, as if steel could be persuaded to behave like cloth. Bulldozers pushed mud into submission with slow arrogance. A line of trucks exhaled diesel. A corporal with a watch and a grease pencil kept times on a board as if this were a factory yard, because it was. A C-47 ghosted in on landing lights, strung an hour before, tyres hissing, doors open before the props wound down, litters in, penicillin out. The airplane lifted again within minutes, a sky artery grafted to a beating island heart. Ellery stood at the edge of the mat and tried to imagine the places that had made this possible. Steel poured in Pennsylvania, rubber cured in Ohio, radios tuned in New Jersey, courage assembled everywhere. The plane became a sentence she could finally read. Armour crawled toward the ridges, M4 Shermans grinding coral under track. 5 men inside worked like one machine. Driver nursing talk, gunner whispering corrections, loader smacking shells home by habit, commander peering through a slit at the world he was supposed to choreograph, bowgun spitting when caves blinked. Infantry flowed in the tank's lee, M1s ready, flamethrower teams moving like careful snakes. The choreography had been learned at Tarawa and corrected at Peleliu. Now it played in mud to a drumbeat of timed artillery lifts and pre-planned smoke. Aiko moved beside Ellery, translating doctor's instructions into the cadence of mother's fear. She had begun to trust the tyranny of schedules. Rations at dawn, vaccinations at noon, evacuation at last light. Democracy, she decided, sounded like a mess line that happened on time. Delgado arrived with a stack of phrase cards laminated against rain, practicing words for just a little while, and you can come tomorrow. His tongue would comply by nightfall. Technicalities spoke louder than speeches. The Marston mat's teeth bit into coral so the mat would not skate. Slats laid with the grain kept puddles from breeding under litters. The sterilizer hissed with temperamental pride. A generator thumped like a hidden drummer. Signalmen checked panels against the sky. Nothing was heroic, and everything was decisive. the kind of work that makes history without insisting on attention. Dusk pulled a hood over the island, and the runway lights blinked on in sequence, a necklace clasped by unseen hands. Another C-47 rose into cloud and left a clean hole that closed behind it. Ellery watched the gap disappear and thought, not of endings, but of the next flight already inbound, the next pallet of supplies already counted somewhere beyond the horizon. In Suboy's cave, the quartermaster laid truth on the floor like confiscated contraband. 2 belts for the machine gun, 15 rounds for each rifleman, 3 grenades if a man was lucky or senior. The silence that followed was not stoic. It was arithmetic accepting itself. The staff could still speak of fields of fire and reverse slopes, but the map had turned from territory into apology. Outside, the enemy's day proceeded with the indifferent dignity of a schedule. An American platoon pulled back before dawn, not from fear, but to leave space for engineers to cut a new road trace along the spur. By lunch, the graders had turned ravine into avenue and the convoy came on, each truck in its time window, each pallet as inevitable as weather. Suboy watched through glasses that made the world both closer and colder. The ridge fell by afternoon because the road had arrived on time, because fuel had arrived before the road, because somebody far away had counted gaskets and bolts weeks ago. He had learned enough to understand what he saw. M4. Shermans rotated where tracks would hold. Flamethrower teams moved up when caves blinked. Infantry flowed like water once rock was cracked. The guns in the distance did not rage, they conversed. Time-on-target missions dropped shells like a curtain, then lifted to let men walk forward. It was theatre run by logisticians, naval gunfire measured in tons per hour, artillery battalions firing by the clock rather than by hope. Rumours of American abundance kept wearing civilian faces, families slipping through lines, children returning with blankets and stories of rice issued twice a day, of bandages opened without counting, of cigarettes given away like punctuation. Suboy forbade himself anger. Propaganda requires starvation to stay convincing. It cannot compete with a schedule and a full pot. He had also received a fact that might as well have been a fable. The Americans had built on the order of 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks and more than 21,000 DUKW amphibious trucks. The numbers were so large they refused to live in his head. He tried to imagine them as villages, each tank a house with 5 souls inside, each DUKW a ferry that never tired, and failed. The failure was instructive. It told him he was counting the wrong kind of country. At dusk, he ordered a withdrawal to the next line and watched as civilians refused to follow. The men still carried slogans. The children carried bowls. When darkness finally unclenched its fist, Suboy turned down the lantern wick and found that his hands would not stop shaking. He understood that his soldiers still had courage, and that courage had been made obsolete by a nation that could mass-produce tomorrow. The captured schoolhouse had a chalk smell that felt almost indecent after months of cordite and rain. On a table under a poncho roof lay the war reduced to columns, casualty rolls, ration counts, a timeline from Saipan, 1944, to Okinawa, 1945. Delgado, Ellery and Aiko leaned over the paper like conspirators. They were not strategists, but they had earned the right to read what they had lived. The narrative widened until it touched cities none of them would ever see. Aircraft totals sat in blunt type. Roughly 354,000 American planes produced across the war against Japan's 76,000. In 1944 alone, American factories had turned out on the order of 96,000 aircraft to Japan's 28,000. M4 Shermans, about 49,000. DUKWs, more than 21,000. Numbers so large they felt like landscapes rather than facts. The chalk squeaked when Ellery underlined them, as if the board itself resisted the weight. They did not let the numbers float free of cost. Okinawa's roll listed more than 12,000 American dead and tens of thousands wounded. Japanese military dead ran near 90,000. Civilians, an absence almost beyond counting, had perished by the 100,000. The ledger did not forgive. It only remembered. Aiko traced a line from rations issued to infants vaccinated and saw how arithmetic could mean mercy when a nation chose the right column to fill. Command names had become familiar like family nicknames. 10th Army, 3rd Amphibious Corps, 24th Corps. After General Buckner's death on June 18th, Lieutenant General Roy Geiger had taken temporary command. General Joseph Stilwell assumed after June 23rd. The machine had shifted gears without stripping a tooth. Camps expanded, airfields multiplied, convoys arrived as if summoned by timetable. The continuity itself felt like a blanket thrown over chaos, stitched together by shipping schedules, depot ledgers, and the unglamorous precision of clerks. They spoke in the small voice that people use in church. Democracy, Delgado said, is a mess line that happens when it should, Ellery added, and a ward that keeps its promise under fire. Aiko, who had once lived under orders, screamed from a cave mouth, said nothing. She held a gum wrapper folded into a square and imagined an assembly line that could make such useless kindness possible at the edge of hell. When they stepped out into the glare, the camp sounded like industry. Generators thumped, typewriters clicked, a cook banged ladles against a dented pot. Down the slope, a column of children walked 2 by 2 toward a tent where someone had chalked school. The sight made sense of the ledger, of every ton unloaded in rain and every mat panel bolted to coral. The continent had moved, yes, but only so that a line could form safely here. At Corps headquarters, a staff major briefed a plan that would never be executed, arrows stabbing Japan with names that would become footnotes: Olympic, Coronet. The maps were not fantasies. They were the next steps of a machine already in motion. Delgado stood at the back as a courtesy detail and felt relief, not because the war would end soon, no one said that aloud, but because the plan looked like a problem his country had already solved twice. The doctrine that had emerged from the islands was simple, the way a bridge is simple. 16 airfields, layer logistics, stabilize civilians, make the next landing easier than the last. Tanks push when tracks will hold. Infantry flows when artillery lifts. Engineers cut roads before ambition outruns supply. Civil affairs is not charity, it is a combat multiplier. Every family fed frees a patrol. Every rumour punctured saves a life on both sides. The checklist can feel cold until you notice it produces warm meals, steady water points, and space for children to sleep without flinching at thunder. A letter from home reached Ellery with a glossy photograph tucked inside. Rows of women riveting under a banner about shifts, hair tied up in scarves, sleeves rolled. She could see her ward tent mirrored there, lights at midnight, hands busy, a foreman's bark turned into a nurse's calm. On the back, someone had scrawled a statistic. Our plant put out more engines this month than Japan built fighters last spring. Ellery did not know if the comparison was exact. She knew its spirit was. She taped the photograph inside a ledger where only numbers usually lived, a small heresy against abstraction. Tsuboi, in a cave that smelled of coal oil and patience, drafted orders that felt increasingly like translations from a language the war no longer spoke. He would have counselled a final stand if he believed it could change anything beyond the ledger's timing. He had the dignity to see that courage had become a currency no longer accepted at the front. The staff major clicked his pointer against a final map and spoke of shipping schedules laid months out, of repair ships and depot echelons, of redundancy mistaken by the enemy for waste. He mentioned hospital ships, not as symbols but as infrastructure, and said almost gently that the point of all this counting was to keep promises. Delgado thought of rice, ladled twice a day, and nodded without meaning to. When the meeting broke, the pins came out of the maps and fell into a tin cup with light metallic clinks. Each sounded like the end of a thunderstorm's last rain. Outside, a convoy growled past on a road that had not existed 3 mornings ago, proof that the doctrine of enough had been paid forward again. When the guns slackened to a distance and the island smelled more of boiled rice than cordite, Aiko sat at a table made from ammunition crates and wrote in a salvaged notebook. She listed items the way a quartermaster might, because survival had depended on them as much as courage had. Gauze, water, soup, quinine, chocolate. Beside the list, she sketched a tent, a square of matting, and the outline of a DUKW's blunt bow nosing into floodwater, as if into destiny. Delgado turned in his rifle that afternoon, his M1's finish scuffed to honest grey, the 8-round clip clicking home one last time before the armourer eased it free. He felt a tiredness that ran bone-deep and a gratitude that did not need words. Ellery walked her ward a final circuit, touching cots as if closing books, then signed a stack of forms whose bureaucratic neatness would have looked indecent anywhere else. Neatness here meant continuity. Continuity meant life. A staff sheet circulated with the kind of totals that had carried them from Saipan to Okinawa and toward an ending not yet named. American aircraft production across the war had reached on the order of 354,000, Japan's roughly 76,000. In 1944 alone, the disparity had been nearly 96,000 to 28,000. Sherman's about 49,000, DUKW's more than 21,000. Statistics that seemed impossible until you watched them turn into airstrips, convoys, wards, and schedules that held even when men fell. Tsuboi, who had measured courage against arithmetic until the units no longer matched, burned his last orders and kept the ash in a tea tin. He might have ordered a final stand, but it would only have made a cleaner photograph of defeat. Instead, he watched families walk toward American camps and understood that a weapon had been used against him that no manual had taught him to counter. Abundance deployed as policy. Eiko chose her word again with care. Angels, she wrote, not as a headline or a claim, not as praise for men who would have rejected it, but as a translation for the shock of organized mercy in a place built to erase it. She knew there had been nights of terror and mornings of ruin. She also knew that the mess line had formed on time, that rice had been ladled twice a day, that vaccination needles had flashed like tiny bayonets for life. She closed the notebook with twine and tucked inside it a gum wrapper she had kept since Saipan. Outside, dawn worked light into the mud, while a column of children walked 2 by 2 toward a tent somebody had chalked school. The camp looked suddenly less like an armature of war and more like a factory for normal life. The revelation was simple enough to carry without a map. A free people had learned to mass-produce tomorrow.